Welcome back to the Moynihan Report. I'm your host, Michael Moynihan, and today I'm extremely excited because we have a guest. We talk about Vice a lot on the show. I've talked about working there. I've written about it. I try not to go on too much about it. But when I worked at Vice, the batting average was fairly low sometimes of some of the stuff that was produced. But there was one journalist there who always produced the best stuff, and it was my favorite person there, although I never saw him very much. But he is here today, and it is Hamilton Morris. He is a chemist, a journalist, actually a chemist, right? Just I'm sure, but a journalist, documentary filmmaker, et cetera, et cetera. Thanks for being here, Hamilton.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I want to say you're a researcher on drugs. You write about drugs. You know more than almost anybody else about the subject. I heard you talking about this recently, and I wanted to talk to you about fentanyl because it is this scare that we hear everywhere to justify tariffs, potential military action, that we should bomb Mexico because of fentanyl. And it's this kind of, America's being torn apart and the middle of the country is being hollowed out by people dying from fentanyl. I think that there's something weird about this narrative. Am I wrong?
There's always something weird about any reductionist drug scare story. Yeah. I mean, no matter what it is, it should be regarded with skepticism. And it's often the case that it's not apparent until some time has passed. So, if you look at the New York Times and look at articles about cocaine from 100 years ago, you look at it and you think, oh my God, they were really writing that? That was published? How could they?
Or crack 30 years ago. Right?
Or crack, or pretty much any drug. I would say that the chances of it being radically misrepresented are extremely high. I can barely think of any instances where that's not the case. Maybe thalidomide or fen or a few different pharmaceutical examples, but when it comes to
Vioxx or things like that.
Vioxx, But when it comes to illicit drugs, there's a tendency to blame the drugs themselves and not the overarching political legal structure that promotes certain types of drug problems. So even if fentanyl is as bad of a problem as it is presented, then the question is, why is fentanyl an issue? And I think it's clear that it's a product of Prohibition. They've actually surveyed drug users, and the majority of them don't want to be using fentanyl. So that is a good situation for law enforcement. You have people using a drug that they don't want to be using. It should be an easy problem to solve. But lack of access to safer, regulated alternatives, prohibition of opioids, all these things promote a market where it's easy for fentanyl to proliferate. It's a very easy drug to synthesize. Once people figure out a way to do it, there's really no going back. It's too simple of a molecule. It's too profitable. The profit margins are too large. And that's a kind of crucial dimension of all of this.
So most people aren't doing fentanyl. That's not the idea, is I'm going to get some fentanyl and get high off fentanyl. It's in heroin. It sometimes contaminates cocaine. It seems rarely, but it does happen. But as far as fentanyl as a drug that is recreational and people use, not common?
For some people. I mean, there are people that seek out actual fentanyl. There's a number of reasons that it's considered sort of undesirable. One is that it actually has an ultra short duration, which most people don't talk about. So even if you are using fentanyl all the time, even if it's controlled, it just lasts a couple of hours. It requires a sort of crack-like cycle of redosing that is typically undesirable for a lot of people, especially long-term.
Yeah, because the framing of it is always, we have an envelope of fentanyl and it could kill 200 million people. They always have these insanely high numbers. Yeah. And I'm trying to figure out how they get to those numbers, which seems absurd to me.
Oh, it's like when they say street value, and it's like street value, $500 million, and it's obviously going to be dramatically inflated. Yeah, I think the fentanyl thing is been politicized in a way that's dangerous. I think that a lot of this has very little to do with helping people. It has very little to do with genuine concern about opioid addicts and protecting them. And I think it's become a political tool more than anything else. I've talked about this a couple of times in the past, but anytime you can associate something with badness, that you can then use it to justify almost anything. This happened with PCP in the 1970s very prominently, where if you frighten enough people, then if a cop kills someone and says that they were on PCP, then it suddenly becomes a little bit more understandable.
Which was the narrative with Rodney King, by the way, which turned out not to be true, that he was not on PCP. The idea was that they shot him with how many volts from a taser, and he took them out of his chest, refused to go down. And then the narrative for a very, very long time was that because he had superhuman strength from angel dust, which turned out to be not true at all.
Interesting. I've never actually reviewed the Rodney King toxicology stuff, but that is pretty common that, this whole concept of excited delirium is this pseudo-medical classification that's used to justify excessive force. And all you have to do is frighten people. I mean, that's the first step in any of this, is figure out a way to get people afraid, and then you can control them. And drug scares have been an extremely reliable way of controlling people.
The journalism around illegal drugs, I mean, it's been incredibly bad over the past, let me just say 30 years or something. Why do you think that is? I mean, there seems to be like a competitive market here, so it should invite people who do good journalism about drugs, but that seems to never happen.
Yeah, and I'll catch myself complaining about this, and I'll think, it's so bad. How is it so bad? And then I think, well, you shouldn't be complaining. You should just be making the good journalism. But the reality is that it's sometimes a little bit more difficult to sell these more nuanced stories. This is something that I've noticed, and this is one reason that I think a lot of people with niche expertise in a various domain gravitate toward Patreon or something like that, as opposed to the mainstream legacy media corporations, is especially when you get into very specialized knowledge in something, there's often a reluctance to even get into the weeds on something. Why go into all of the details of why MDMA was rejected by the FDA when you can just kind of have a easy scare story that...
Because that was last year, right? That the FDA rejected MDMA, ecstasy, as for in a medicinal way to treat people that have depression or whatever it might be. What was the reason given for it, and why do you not buy it?
The FDA's response letter still has not been made public, so the exact reason is not known. There was a publicly available advisory committee hearing that you can watch on YouTube where various issues were discussed that ranged from maybe slightly valid to ridiculous. I mean, the criticisms were things like that the pharmaceutical company had failed to record data on whether or not MDMA causes euphoria in the patient population, which is... it's one of these things where it's like, well, what do you even, if it's, I think in a normal population of MDMA users, it's probably something around 80-90%, maybe more of users experience euphoria. Maybe it's maybe it's slightly less in people that have severe PTSD. But what would be, like, I'm in favor of asking questions like that because it's psychopharmacologically interesting, but at some point it's like, how is that a valid justification for rejecting a treatment when the evidence supports that the benefits outweigh the risks? So a lot of people are very frustrated by this decision. It's immensely expensive to repeat a phase 3 clinical trial. The repetition of this work that's already been done is costing tens of millions of dollars. And the other reason, and this was recently reported in Wired by John Semley, he wrote an absolutely amazing article that people listening to this should read. It kind of gently introduces what I think is an extremely scandalous revelation, which is that private interests were funding an activist group who played an enormous role in the FDA's rejection.
What type of activist group? I mean, it's not a traditional sort of Nancy Reagan say no to drugs group.
Very much no. It's a totally left-wing psychedelic activist group. That's what was sort of unexpected, is you would have thought, okay, MDMA, it's being evaluated for approval by the FDA. There's going to be a Christian Mothers Coalition that's going to come along and say, wait a second, you're approving ecstasy? Doesn't that make holes in the brains of our children? Aren't they going to get addicted? But what actually happened was it was a group of disgruntled people who were leveraged by a woman whose father left a lot of his fortune to MAPS, and she felt...
Explain what MAPS is.
MAPS is MAPS is a nonprofit that was the sort of parent company of a public benefit corporation called Lycos that was developing the MDMA.
Yeah.
There was a split of these two groups, and so there was a person with a lot of money and an axe to grind, and they paid $185,000 to an activist group to run a campaign.
Is it that cheap to buy people? Like, a group of, acid-loving hippies will take $185,000 and then turn and make sure that something doesn't become legal?
Well, crucially, this was not totally out of line with their beliefs. These were people who were already operating in a highly critical capacity.
Yeah.
So it was a kind of symbiotic meeting of two groups with...
What was the criticism?
The criticism was, it's so ridiculous. A lot of this stuff, it was that MAPS was a cult, was one of the criticisms, analogous to Nexium. This is, of course, just not a idea that is supported by any of the participants in the clinical trials. It's also, it's almost ridiculous to even acknowledge.
It's almost irrelevant.
There was one instance of abuse of one of about 300 participants in the trials, which was acknowledged by MAPS and acknowledged by everyone involved, and everyone understood that it was unacceptable. But this was not in any way representative of the therapy. It wasn't a situation where they were suggesting this was a good thing or denying that it had happened or anything like that. So it was really a amazing instance of a lot of people coming together to destroy 40 years of work.
When I hear things like this, I'm skeptical of them, and I usually, because I read the piece that you're talking about, I usually think it's bullshit, sort of conspiracy yarn. And it turns out in this case that it's absolutely true. And, on top of that, you mentioned this, I want to ask you a few things about Vice too, but you mentioned not long ago that Vice, the company where you produced Hamilton's Pharmacopeia, which was one of the best things that Vice ever produced. It was an absolutely brilliant show. And you mentioned that in that later iteration of Vice, as it was wheezing to its end, they became anti-psychedelic. Mm-hmm. They were producing these pieces. And, politically, I don't understand it. This is the people that are broadly of the left. One would presume they oppose prohibition. And that's wrong to presume. And I still don't understand why.
Oh, it's easy for me to understand.
Yeah.
And around the time that I left Vice, the entire psychedelic medicalization project appeared to be a very well lubricated machine. Everything was going pretty well, to the point that I actually felt like, all right, I made this show for years and it was incredibly difficult, and made it a time where doing things as trivial as recording somebody growing mushrooms, something that we could probably in a 10-block radius find 5 people willing to let us film them growing mushrooms. But when I was doing that, it's amazing to look back and think about how sketchy and frightening, not frightening to me in terms of that I was frightened for my safety, but what if something were to happen to the people who were allowing me to film themselves growing? It felt very, very risky, because at that time it was. And by the time that I had finished the 3rd season, I felt that things had changed so dramatically that it was basically on autopilot. Everyone's making the documentary about how PTSD is treated by MDMA. Everyone's making their thing about how mushrooms are good. And I just felt like, all right, I'll let other people cover this. I would prefer to just work in a lab and do chemistry for a couple of years, and that's what I did. I left New York City, did chemistry for years, and then watched as the entire psychedelic journalism world collapsed into complete insanity of unfathomable proportions.
What was the proximate cause of that?
Well, one is that there were a number of warring factions within the psychedelic community who had various grudges against one another.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of these people have been working together in some capacity for many years. And so there was somebody who'd worked at Johns Hopkins University, had a grudge against those people. So there you have one kind of seed of a grudge forming at Johns Hopkins. And you have another one between the owners of these two pharmaceutical companies, USONA and Compass, where they hate each other as well. Then you have these two things that have happened at MAPS, where one is that there was this instance of sexual abuse of a patient, and the other is that there was this very rich man who willed a portion of his fortune to MAPS, enraging his heirs. So these kind of disparate incidents festered and were the infection was nourished by journalists who opportunistically saw that there were good stories to be told in exploiting these problems. And the sad thing about this is I find if you look behind a lot of these scare stories, there's still a really good story.
Yeah.
There's still a really good story that could be told. It's just usually the story of the story as opposed to the story as they think they're telling it. If they could just take one step back and realize what's actually going on. For example, with Vice, what had happened was there was this, there's a very, very profitable bioscience company called Promega, and the owner of Promega is a billionaire. And he funnels the money from his for-profit company into a nonprofit. And that nonprofit is splintered into a series of other nonprofits. So one is USONA, the other is Freedom to Operate, the other is Porta Sofia, and then the other co-founder of this has a number of for-profit companies, Be More, which actually may technically be a nonprofit, in Ceruvia. So there's this confusing, potentially boring web of companies all connected to one another. And they were very good at working with journalists to present themselves as extremely sympathetic, even though there's actually nothing even remotely sympathetic about these people. One of them is like was just maybe 20 years ago bragging about his financial connection to Exxon and Shell. The other one's a billionaire. Like there's really nothing particularly good about what they're doing, but they framed a patent battle that they were having with a competitor, which I should mention is the pharmaceutical company that was sponsoring the medicinal chemistry work that I was doing for years. So I do have a legitimate conflict of interest in talking about this. This is kind of something that should be acknowledged. But the war between these two companies was played out in various blogs, and Vice was a major source of this reporting, and it was insane, some of the stuff that came out.
Like insane in the sense that it was inaccurate, overdone, just bad journalism.
Well,
because I saw so much of that I stopped paying attention to it.
Well, this is the beauty of journalism, is you can actually, within the umbrella of totally responsible, factual journalism, you can do and say things that are completely irresponsible. Mm-hmm. And one example that really stands out to me is there was the Dr. Bronner's soap company.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So the current owner of Dr. Bronner's, David Bronner, has been a funder of a lot of psychedelic initiatives. He's a good guy. He gives money to a lot of people. He was a big funder of USONA. I don't actually know why, because it's owned by billionaires. I would think that David Bronner could use his money in better places than giving it to people that are already immensely wealthy. Yeah. But he was on their side against Compass, the other competitor company. And they were looking for ways to make Compass look as evil as possible. And one of the major concerns that people have had about medicalization, and there's some validity, is, well, what if medicalization, instead of facilitating policy reform, actually interferes with it in some way? Mm-hmm. What if these same people that are developing psychedelics as medicines are actually going to make things worse? it's an unlikely scenario because all of these psychedelics are Schedule 1 controlled substances. They already occupy the highest level of restriction that our government can possibly use to designate a molecule. But for the sake of argument, okay. And the evidence for this didn't exist. The evidence for this claim that this company Compass was interfering with drug policy reform was non-existent. No one was ever saying this. So a funder of one of these companies, and as I'm saying this, I realize that it's sort of confusing. One company was releasing false information saying that their competitor was interfering with drug policy reform, but there was no evidence for this whatsoever. And it was getting reported as if it was a valid thing to say. And that was one of the early moments where I thought, ooh, this is going to get messy because no one's talking about it, nobody's mentioning, and it just kept getting worse and worse and worse.
When you saw that, at a company that you had been associated with for a very long time and you did, so much great work with, did you intercede in any way and say, guys, this is a lot of really bad journalism about a subject that I know extremely well and can show you why it's bad?
No, it felt like it might be slightly unethical to even attempt to do that because at the time I was working in a lab that was receiving funding from the company that was the subject of these criticisms. So I wanted to stay out of it. I also didn't know anyone advice. I was gone. I mean, pretty much everyone that I was friends with was long gone. I have no idea who is responsible for editing the Vice blog right now.
Does this still exist? I think it still exists.
It probably still exists, but it's like astrology.
They did have somebody on staff that was an astrologer. Was paid. Was the what's her name? The Nancy Reagan's astrologer.
Joan Quigley.
Joan Quigley. Yeah, there was like a version of that, and she was paid like a proper salary to routinely write about astrology for Vice. But when you see this stuff, and that's the thing that breaks if you have any trust in. Not in the media as a sort of mustache twisting, evil conspiracy, but that any of these people are competent is when it trespasses upon something that you know about. And the second you see that, you're like, oh God, wait, is all of this kind of wrong, seat of the pants stuff by kids that are 24 years old who just got out of Sarah Lawrence College and are getting paid $75,000 a year to write about things to a mass audience that they don't understand? That's what I saw often.
And often don't care. I mean, so the other example would be that during the FDA hearing, there was a commentary period, and this entire activist group occupied a huge portion of the commentary period. And during this period, one of the activists, Nishay Devanau, falsely accused a MAPS therapist of pinning down a patient while they screamed, "Get your fucking hands off of me." And this was taken radically out of context. It had absolutely nothing to do with MDMA psychotherapy or the MAPS trial. They had found a passage in a book written by this therapist where they were describing ketamine psychotherapy, and in that passage they describe a patient who is speaking to the memory of their father who had abused them, saying, "Get your fucking hands off of me." So just totally out of context. And things like that just were uncritically repeated. I mean, this took me 2 minutes or less to just look up the book and verify that this was taken out of context. And I remember contacting one of the journalists at Vox and saying, hey, in a friendly way, I'm not trying to do this in hey, you should probably take a look at this so you can see for yourself that this is taken out of context. No response whatsoever. And it is alarming how there's so little reward also for the people that do amazing work. Someone like John Semley, being able to publish this piece in Wired where the payment of this activist group is finally made public, something that journalists from the New York Times had tried and not succeeded. And there's no reward for him. He gets paid some small amount of money as a freelance journalist. He was so afraid of being accused of being a MAPS paid shill that when he was at the recent MAPS conference, he wouldn't accept any hotel or airline travel. I mean, there's a lot of sacrifices that have to be made to retrieve something that ends up being one sentence in print. And I don't think that there is a recognition of how much work goes into something like that relative to a Vice blog where you just think, oh, I'll just kind of imply that this pharmaceutical company is interfering with drug policy reform, and if it creates a mess, whatever, I'll move on to the next thing.
They work backwards from that narrative because it's the big drug company has never been a good thing. It's always a bad thing. As somebody who's a type 1 diabetic, I absolutely love pharmaceutical companies because they are very generously keep me alive every day. So I didn't have the same thing that I saw from people who start from the premise that clearly, like the Sackler family is a great example of this. There's a lot of bad stuff there. But this idea that this one kind of sinister family that almost becomes like a collective Bond villain, it created an entire drug crisis in America, makes the story much easier, much more palatable. It fits people's political priors. And it's not that it's not true, but the emphasis seems to me wrong on stuff like this. The reporting, that's one of the ones that sticks out to me for like bad drug reporting is like, yeah, the Sacklers, are pretty interesting. And Patrick Radden Keefe's book on this is interesting, but it seems like wildly overstated to kind of satiate that need to have one villain. And it's especially good if that villain is some kind of faceless corporation.
Yeah, and to ignore systemic contributions to opioid addiction, because this is the real heart of the issue, is that if somebody is healthy psychologically and financially and supported by their environment, they typically don't fall victim to severe substance abuse problems. Of course, some people do,
sure,
but
yeah.
A lot of what is being reductionistly described as a problem with drugs themselves are really issues with mental health, lack of resources for treatment once a problematic relationship with the drug emerges. And yeah, the Sackler stuff I thought was kind of, it's like, it was easy because Richard Sackler was demonstrably a huge asshole.
Yeah,
so
this is undeniably true.
This
yes.
is not a hard case to make. You could fill pages and pages and pages with horrifying, insensitive, creepy things that he said.
Sure.
And being a billionaire, he's not a particularly sympathetic character. But the flip side is that it fails to acknowledge the reality that at each link of this chain, people kind of knew what was going on.
Yeah.
The idea that physicians didn't know
Yes.
that oxycodone was an addictive drug, the idea that patients didn't know, it's a little bit infantilizing. And I remember the way the New York Times reported on this, they would talk about, uncovering documents that would show that Purdue is aware that oxycodone is an addictive drug. And it just seems so absurd to me, because how could they have not known?
Yeah.
There was a medical term for oxycodone addiction that dates back about 100 years, eucadalism. So a word specifically for addiction to oxycodone. And we're acting, I remember being a child and there would be jokes about oxycodone addiction on The Simpsons in the 90s. So you're saying that a general audience on The Simpsons would be expected to understand a joke about oxycodone addiction, but none of these physicians knew that oxycodone
Or the
was...
parent company, yeah.
This is like, it just seemed unrealistic. And also I think about, again, myself as a child, and how did I know that these drugs were... I already knew. This was not some kind of like super sophisticated pharmacological knowledge that like Percodan was a thing that people enjoyed using.
Yeah. No, I mean, one of the things that, because, I don't follow this, even 1/10 as closely as you do. But there was one story that I was shouting from the rooftops and no one cared, because it's not a huge story. But a long time ago, I did a story for Vice about vaping early on. I went and met the guys that did Juul in San Francisco. And I interviewed this doctor named Michael something or other, but he's now at Tufts. He was at BU. And he was a big enemy of the tobacco companies. He would go and testify. And he said to me, and he did this blog where he would just debunk literally every study about vaping that was like, everyone has popcorn lung and kids like bubblegum flavors and everyone's vaping. And he basically said this stuff isn't true. And he said to me, if every person on the planet started vaping instead of smoking, would save millions of lives a year, which struck me as obviously transparently true. And a few years back, there was a story about vaping and how people were dying. And I challenge anyone out there to go look at these. It says vaping, people dying. This is in the middle of these stories about Juul. And you got 4 or 5 paragraphs in and you realize people were dying of vaping bootleg weed, like weed vapes that were being sold in bodegas. It had nothing to do with nicotine. And it's almost like saying drinking kills you, and it turns out they're drinking chlorine or Clorox or something. And it's like that, the verb is not necessary here. But that kind of reporting, it's a great headline. In the frequency with which I saw it in mainstream news publications, and no one decided to ever check this, and except this one doctor who was pulling his hair out. He was like, this is completely wrong. Like, and it's demonstrably wrong. I mean, the RFK stuff is everything he says strikes me as probably wrong too. But there's a political reason for going in on him. Like, this other stuff just gets ignored. And I still don't quite understand why no one cares and no one checks these things out.
Just say it because they don't care.
Because they don't care. Yeah, that's actually the answer. Yeah.
So, in that instance, the chemical in question was vitamin E acetate.
That's
that was
right.
Being used as a sort of...
Why would I think that you wouldn't know that? Yeah, of course you do.
As a vehicle for THC, and it was killing people.
Yeah.
But this is a problem with inhalation of vitamin E acetate, not with vaping in general. It's complicated because you see people who are occupying both sides in such extremes. You have people who are vaping proponents, who are... I remember going on Joe Rogan a couple of years ago, and he said, vaping's really bad or something. I said, I don't know, I'm a little on the fence about it. I didn't agree with him. I just didn't really push back. And getting all these enraged...
Oh, they're serious.
Messages
the vaping people.
From the vaporists. And they, like, I trusted you. How could you betray me like this?
Yeah.
And, with smoking, the dangers are very, very well characterized. You have inhalation of, soot particles, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, potentially trace quantities of polonium.
There's polonium in cigarettes?
Interestingly,
Wow.
weirdly.
Wow.
Very, very weirdly. So the carbon monoxide, cyanide.
Sure.
So these are all, well characterized problems with inhalation of tobacco smoke. With vaping, the concerns were more speculative and nebulous. What does it do to your lungs to inhale large quantities of propylene glycol all the time? What about the kind of weird sociological dimensions of you can't smoke indoors anymore, but you can vape indoors? You hit a vape right before we started this interview.
And I really want to right now. I need it, but I'm like trying to not do it.
I know, I kind of want to. And then the issue of a sort of counterfeit Elf bar type product, like the one that you have hiding under your arm. It's definitely a counterfeit.
This is the biggest fugazi of all time.
Then you have the metal design of the coil. That there was a recent study that was published where they showed that this would actually release the particulate heavy metals into the vapor stream.
And the coil is what heats the vapor itself.
It heats the propylene glycol.
The glycol, solution. Which, by the way, is always said, and it's funny how these things are presented. And it's like, that's the stuff in air conditioners or in car radiators or something. And that's what you're inhaling. And it's like, is it really though? Is that exactly what I'm inhaling? But this is something that I see so frequently with vaping is kind of the top one on this one, because you also see it with, what is it called? Zyn, these Zyn things. I lived in Sweden for a long time, and it's snus in Sweden, right? Girls, it's not a gender that girls do it. I remember first going and I was seeing people putting this stuff on their lips, and it was banned throughout the European Union but there was no evidence that it was causing oral cancer in the same way that Skoal was, for instance. But it was just the sense of it, right? Why ban vaping indoors? It's not a noxious, it's just, it kind of it feels like smoking. I mean, they refer to it as smoking in so many FDA documents. It's just like, just the general gist of it we want you to think is equivalent to the thing that you're trying to quit, which I find kind of offensive in a way. Because I started vaping, I haven't smoked a cigarette since, not one. And that was 2016. So I think it's a positive thing.
And I don't do either. I do the Lucy pouches, like the Zyn type of different.
Yeah.
But if I were you, I would make the same choice. Even having read these studies about the potential particulate contamination of heavy metals in the vapor stream or whatever, it's complicated. And again, this is a classic situation where public perception is so clouded by industry interests that I think a lot of people struggle to even have a intuitive grasp of what makes sense because everything has been so radicalized and polarized where, on one hand you have people saying that it's unethical to sell something that's mango flavored.
Yeah.
And it's like, well,
I always love this idea that you can't sell flavors because kids like flavors, and apparently adults, we just don't like flavors.
Yeah. I've known an adult or two that likes mango.
Yeah, and also tobacco is a flavor. It's just not the best flavor. So you're banning the flavors that you think are the good flavors,
Yeah.
But if you ask people, just the average person isn't paid, that if nicotine is dangerous, nicotine, cigarettes, it's addictive, but is it dangerous? Is it the thing that will, give you lung cancer? And the answer is no. But people don't know this because, there's just a drumbeat of this stuff where, you want to take it as, a good source of information when you see this stuff in the media. And after the sort of tobacco wars of the 80s and 90s, nicotine was something that we talked about all the time. But it's not bad for you in any particular way. I suppose if you drank great quantities of it, but that's probably true of everything.
Yeah. There's, elevates blood pressure, or maybe does something to actually blood glucose. Maybe I don't know if that matters.
Is that true?
I believe so. Yeah, oh. But it also has some potential positive effects on memory and cognition. And so it's all like all these things. There isn't a simple answer, and it's unreasonable to assume that the public is going to cultivate a extremely intricate understanding of all these things. But I do think it's worthwhile. I remember during the collapse of Vice, I would occasionally get mentioned in these things, and they would actually, I think it was on one of the things where maybe it was like Barry Weiss or someone is like, they even had a guy doing ayahuasca. Like how crazy that there was a guy who did things about drugs. And what's amazing to me is that you have something that's so consequential, something that impacts pretty much every dimension of our lives, whether you're talking about through medicine or addiction or economic dimensions of all this mental health care, that is still marginalized in such a way that people treat it like it's a weird thing to be interested in. Why
are you interested in it? You grew up in Massachusetts. Your father is a phenomenal guy and a great filmmaker. Where did this kind of come into your life as something that you said, well, I want to both research it, make films about it, write about it?
There's a number of different reasons that I find it interesting. I just actually do find it sort of intrinsically interesting. But one thing that I learned early on with journalism or storytelling or whatever is that I didn't like situations where I was competing with other people to tell stories. Like I have this kind of vivid memory of sitting through the Ross Ulbricht Silk Road Market trial, and I was in the courtroom, and it was fascinating, and I'm taking copious notes, and I'm looking around, and there's 7 other people doing exactly the same thing, and I felt,
if not more.
And I remember thinking, do I need to be the 8th person to rush home to report what I have just seen? Can the other 7 do it just fine? And there was something kind of disheartening about it. The flip side is that whenever I'm working in a domain that I feel is totally unexplored, it's immensely satisfying. And I think one of the reasons that I'm drawn to the subject of drugs is because it is covered so terribly that I'm just finding a continuous fountain of incredible information all the time, more than I find new things more quickly than I can report them or talk about them on my podcast or anything like that. Just this last week, I discovered non-publicly known information about a historical clinical trial. This goes back quite a few decades, where 2 of the patients were killed, and it was covered up by the pharmaceutical company. It's not even the first time that I've discovered something like that. And it's not because I'm I have the basic skills of filing FOIA requests and interviewing people and going to archives and things like that. But I honestly think it's just because I'm curious about this stuff, and there's very few people who even bother to look.
Yeah. But you're also interested in the chemistry of it too. You're an actual chemist. I said at the beginning of the show, because, I always imagined that you were some sort of amateur chemist.
I was for a long time.
But you work in a lab, right?
Not at the moment, no.
But you have in the past.
Yeah. I worked but being an amateur is just doing something out of love instead of by profession. Yeah. So for, over a decade, I would work in a lab at a university on the weekends and publish scientific papers, did real research. And that was kind of just a thing that I did. And then I started doing it full time as my actual job for years. And then I'm back to, actually, the way that I've been doing it more recently is I've been kind of making documentaries about chemistry projects as a way to make them possible. So
explain that. You make them possible. So someone funds a documentary, or you go out and try to get somebody behind you to fulfill some idea that you have about something. It's just that's the vehicle to get to the chemistry project.
Yeah, like I had become obsessed and had spent years trying to introduce this element into a psychedelic molecule that's really never used in medicinal chemistry, this element tellurium. And it's a weird enough thing that it's hard to sell people on doing something with this element. And then I started to realize that if I made a documentary about the chemistry, that would give me a framework where I could dedicate, months of time to just focusing on this one insane project. And that's what I've been doing. It's been good.
Have you inspired, I imagine you probably have, some of your father's work? Because, I told you before we started, I interviewed him when he did a very good documentary about Steve Bannon called American Dharma. But fairly recently, a couple things in the kind of MK Ultra, kind of government sponsored LSD stuff. Did you work on those? I presume that you had something to do with them. In the last one being the Charles Manson thing, which is a book that I read and I was very frustrated with, by the way, because it has that universe of, but then gets into the conspiracy stuff of that, it's a mind control Manchurian situation. Yeah. But that's kind of up your alley.
It's certainly up my alley. I'm very interested in MK Ultra, and I'm very interested in understanding the exact areas of medicine and research that were impacted. I know Tom O'Neill a little bit. I think the book is extremely entertaining. I don't want to be a hater. I think that, there's many things in the book that are true. I think maybe the core hypothesis in it that people are interested in, that Charles Manson was programmed by the CIA to, I guess, program the Manson family to kill Sharon Tate, is not something I'm totally sold on. But it's a fascinating dissection of these issues, and the story of Tom O'Neill's investigation is very much worth reading. And there was so much weird stuff going on that's not conspiratorial at all, that isn't speculative. There's Edgewood Arsenal and all of the work that was being done. The American military truly was, and it's an established record. James Ketchum, who's the head of a lot of this psychochemical warfare research at Edgewood, wrote a whole book about it, right? This is not like some kind of you don't even need to go to the conspiracy theorists. Some of the people involved have written tell-all books. It's a known thing that a lot of really bizarre work was done in the name of creating psychochemical weapons or experimenting with mind control, truth serums, things like that.
No, so much of that stuff I greet with skepticism, because it's always the craziest people in the world with the craziest theories who find the shortest distance between the first sentence and MK Ultra, and it gets there really quickly. And so it's made me, and I see books on the shelf about, Blitz, about Nazi drug. I just always assume this is some sort of tabloid sensationalism, but I know that there's actually some truth to it. We have a question. You want me to go? Can we go to the question? Who is the person that has the question? It's a pre-recorded question, by the way. We're doing for the first time. Thomas, it's not Thomas Morton. Do we have a question from Thomas for Hamilton? Let's play that.
Hi there. I'm based in London, and weed is illegal over here. And I've been noticing around the city these weed leafs with a QR code that you can scan, and that takes you through to a website which sells cannabis-like flower, but it actually contains HHC. THC, some of them contain something called THCA, and I think there's THCP on there as well. It's been a while since I've looked. I've done a bit of research online, and a lot of people in the sort of online weed community see these things as margarine. That's the comparison I've heard, and that weed is like butter, that they're very unnatural. I'd just like to know what your thoughts on these cannabinoids are and whether you've come across them. Would you be better off taking sort of regular cannabis with THC in it? Is there any dangers using them?
I mean, you're the perfect person for this question.
Yeah.
I didn't know that there was multiple THCs and A and B and C and the rest of it.
Yeah, there's quite a few.
Yeah.
And they've become like a market in and of themselves, where at first there was a synthetic cannabinoid market, which I covered for Vice, where people would make these totally synthetic compounds that weren't even all that related structurally to THC. And then most of those compounds were prohibited. A lot of the people that were selling them got draconian sentences. There's a great book about it. It was written by Jordan Rubin. And then the market shifted to these hemp-derived sort of, they're sometimes referred to as altnoids, like these sort of, they're not really naturally occurring for the most part. Some of them are entirely synthetic, but they're structurally much closer to THC. And the main one is delta-8 THC, which is an isomer of THC. And you can make these from CBD, which has become extremely inexpensive. And they are often considered borderline interchangeable. I've certainly used quite a bit of delta-8 THC. It's maybe a little bit less potent than THC. I don't know that I could reliably distinguish it in terms of the qualitative effects. HHC has a longer duration. Again, it comes back to this vaping thing where when something is less characterized toxicologically, there's more opportunity to scaremonger. So if someone is saying, well, what about HHC? What do we really know about this chemical compared to THC? And of course, the answer is relatively little. This is something that's really only been used by a large number of humans for a few years. And you can point to the lack of knowledge in this domain and say, doesn't that make it dangerous? Well, not necessarily. I mean, there are dangerous things about it. One of the main dangerous things about HHC is that if it's made in an unregulated lab, the hydrogenation of THC can be extremely dangerous. It actually killed a close friend of mine who worked on the show with me, David Brook, died making HHC. So because you use high pressure hydrogenation and there was a leak in the hydrogen and it blew up the entire facility that he was in. So, things like that's not a toxicological issue with HHC, but there are so many aspects of this. If they're made in unregulated laboratories, it could be dangerous to the people working in those laboratories. There could be residual materials that are present for the people that are using them. Again, this is a kind of something where there's really not sufficient information, but I certainly think that they're safe enough that I've used quite a few of them myself.
But do they exist? I mean, the questioner in London was listing this kind of exhaustive list of these, slightly different things. I mean, those all exist, I presume, because he starts the question by saying weed is illegal. It's to get around prohibitions, right?
Yeah, this is the overarching irony of prohibition, is that it creates all of this insanity. Because I'm an outlier in being someone that's interested in trying a chemical like THCP. Most people would be happy just smoking weed. They don't want to try weird, exotic things, but they're kind of forced into it by the circumstances of our ridiculous drug policy, where they can't have access to something like THC that is well studied, so they end up using this toxicologically unknown material that is made in a likely unregulated lab, and it just makes everybody less safe. If the idea is that the prohibition of these substances is somehow helping people, it's totally ridiculous. And yet the lesson is never learned. No matter how many times this happens, the lesson is never learned. On my podcast, covered the efforts of the DEA to prohibit these two drugs, and I went to DEA headquarters and sat through this hearing that was scheduled for 10 days, and it was one of the most insane things that I've ever seen. I mean, there's no logic in any of this. One of these compounds that they were placing in Schedule 1, the most controlled category, was so obscure that they were unable to provide medical or scientific evidence that a human being had ever ingested it. So forget addiction. It wasn't even an overblown situation where, okay, there was one person and they jumped off a balcony or something like that. This was they weren't able to provide indisputable evidence that a human being had ever ingested this compound, and were basing their case off of a small number of anonymous Reddit reports. And there was a parade of the most absurdly credentialed scientists who came in to say that this would be a hindrance to scientific research, which it is and absolutely would have been, that it was a valuable anti-inflammatory drug. There was an entire pharmaceutical company based on this compound that they couldn't even establish that a human being had ever used, and they still placed it in Schedule 1.
Where does this stuff come from, though? I mean, if no one's actually using it, it can't be some, half-witted bureaucrat who's looking through Reddit and says, well, we have to bring this in front of a enormous, federal commission and bring credentialed scientists in, because we need to make this thing illegal that doesn't exist.
Well, they didn't want to bring these credentialed scientists in. Those were
that's the consequence of this. But why is that even there in the first place? I mean, somebody has to be sniffing these things out, because it's not a real problem. So you have to invent it. Is the idea that, it makes people look good in a political way, that I care about the kids? I mean, it was always the Coalition for Tobacco-Free Kids. And the vaping was all about kids. If it's through that prism, people say, well, yeah, we don't want the kids to do it. I just don't understand what the motivation for these people who present these non-problems as problems, if it just, no one can even identify it.
I think it's a combination of confusion, inefficiency in their entire operation. I mean, it's ridiculous. It was one of the most insane things that I've ever witnessed. And you just see this massive machine that is self-perpetuating its own bullshit.
Yeah.
And there's, it doesn't inspire hope.
Well, the current administration, any noises in one way, in one direction or another about drug policy that either inspire you or depress you?
Well, there was a lot of hope that RFK Jr. would be particularly sympathetic to psychedelic drug policy issues because of his own interest in the domain and the interest of many people close to him. He appointed the first psychedelic czar of the United States. But now the DEA is attempting to prohibit 7-hydroxymetragenine, which is this trace alkaloid present in kratom. And apparently RFK Jr. gave a talk and was supportive of this effort to prohibit it. So I would say it's too early to know with certainty, but preliminarily things have not been too encouraging.
Yeah.
And it's hard because you have a compound like this, some people get addicted to it, there maybe are some problems, but the issue is not learning this very, very, very basic aspect of this, which is that prohibition has never solved any of those problems, right?
Yeah.
It didn't work with heroin, didn't work with cocaine, didn't work with alcohol, spectacularly didn't work with alcohol. It's never worked. It's always caused problems. And so even if there are demonstrable problems, with the fentanyl thing, I'm talking about the propagandistic dimensions of fentanyl, but also, of course, it's also a real problem, but that's a controlled substance. That hasn't solved the problem. So clearly this entire tactic is totally ineffective and needs to be rethought.
I wonder if we're in a moment now, though, that the prohibitionist instinct has returned more than I personally had expected. I was talking to a friend of mine who's an economist and a pretty, well-known one, and we were walking in the city, and I said, what is there anything in your kind of libertarianish brain that has shifted over the past 10 years? Maybe I was wrong about this. And without skipping a beat, he said, marijuana legalization. And, he said it's everywhere. You see it in every corner in New York City. Everywhere you go, you smell it. And he didn't make, it was a sort of emotional argument from somebody who doesn't usually make those arguments. But I've seen that this a little more prohibitionism after the kind of widespread adoption of decriminalization of marijuana. Is that just like
he thinks it should go back to being prohibited?
He didn't say that, and I don't think he would. But I think he was arguing that he didn't foresee the negative social consequences of it. And that was his argument, not mine.
Right. And those consequences existed when it was illegal as well. But now there's the beautiful reality that people won't be locked in cages for possessing it or growing the plant. And I actually think that that's one of the really nice things about freedom is the freedom to dislike something.
Yeah.
And one of the sad things about being stuck in this current area where if anyone does anything wrong, it can result in the prohibition of a substance. And, we were talking about the MAPS trial and these criticisms. There were some valid criticisms, but we're really at a place where all of this is still so precarious. I mean, it's a privilege, it's a luxury to be able to say, I hate drinking. I think drinking is stupid, because we know that it's so established in our culture that nobody's going to attempt to prohibit alcohol again.
Yeah.
And you could argue that it's nice that people can say they hate weed, because that's in some dimension a sort of apolitical opinion that people should be free to have, as long as their dislike of the plant doesn't extend to thinking that people should go to prison for possessing it.
Yeah. We had a question from Thomas in London, and I said, maybe it's Thomas Morton, who is, he's been a guest on the show. He's also a former vice host, also a former Hamilton roommate, I hear. But then we actually did have a question from Thomas. So Thomas is here. And Thomas, I got to say something. When we did the episode about Gavin, which I never thought was going to actually be released, it turned out that it was.
Same.
Same. And produced a bit of a reaction. We could maybe get to it.
Delayed, but
it
strong.
was a delayed reaction. It was a strong reaction. I watched a bit of that, and I was like a fat guy then, and I'm still a fat guy. You look like you've lost like
I was thinking the same thing. Thomas
50
looks like he's lost
pounds.
weight.
What is going on? You look
I'm dying.
Oh, is that right?
No. I shed some winter weight. I also got a haircut, which shouldn't necessarily affect how fat your face looks, but it really does wonders on me.
You look like
almost
Marky
like an
Smith
optical
now.
illusion.
Yeah.
But thank you for noticing. That's
you
sweet.
look great. But your question for your
both of you. It's good to see you guys. Yeah. Big fan of your stuff, both of you. But so my question, I remember last year there was kind of like a minor, let's call it a kerfuffle in the super like weird online right wing things about Kanye West doing nitrous, and I think it was that guy Milo Yiannopoulos, the fake gay dude.
Yeah.
Was saying that he
he's
had
an
a nitrous
ex-gay.
problem.
He was a real gay, but now he's an ex-gay. Yeah.
Right. Who could have seen that coming? And that there was like some charlatan was pushing like a nitrous delivery system on Kanye West. Anyway, it brought up a question that I'd kind of forgotten over a decade, which is whatever happened to the Philadelphia nitrous mafia? Was that ever solved, or are they still running the show?
The Philadelphia nitrous mafia. Are you familiar with this?
I'm familiar, yeah.
Oh, I'm familiar. Were you a member of this mafia?
No, never.
So, for Thomas's point, people don't. There was Milo Yiannopoulos, who somehow got a job with Kanye West. I don't know how that happened. Was saying that he had a dentist that was giving him nitrous, and the reason that he no longer thought the Holocaust happened was because of a dentist who gave him nitrous, or he was a Nazi because of it, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to attribute all of his beliefs to nitrous, but it's an established fact that he does a lot of nitrous.
Yeah.
And in terms of Thomas's question about the Philly nitrous mafia.
Yeah, what is the Philly nitrous mafia?
I mean, it's a gas, so it's a little bit harder to distribute. You need cylinders. Historically, there was a group that would sell these cylinders, and people call it hippie crack because it can be very addictive for some people. Something that I didn't get until I'd seen it with my own eyes, because I've used nitrous oxide many times, but would always have one or two. But if you're around somebody who is inhaling, vast quantities of it, you realize that there are some people that are susceptible to a totally different type of compulsive use pattern that I didn't truly know about. I'd read about it until I saw it with my own eyes. I mean, there are people that will use it all night until it's all gone. They won't stop. And
that just can't be good. I don't know. Maybe it's fine, but it just seems like it's bad.
I suspect that it's, especially because when you do something like that medically, it's co-administered with oxygen.
Yeah.
I mean, there's potential risk for hypoxia as well as, depletion of B12. There's a number of problems with it. But what's interesting about the Philly nitrous mafia and those sorts of things is that the entire distribution network changed, and that changes the patterns of use. So now you see these massive cylinders of the brand is Galaxy Gas. I mean, just the other day I was walking down Broadway and I took a photo of it actually. I saw 3 massive cylinders. I mean, they're not quite the size, but they're almost the size of a scuba tank. They're big cylinders of gas, and there were just 3 out on the street that had been, emptied, presumably at a party or something. And again, you see the same thing with nitrous, all these drugs, the same story over and over and over again, where there will be a subset of people who develop problematic relationships with it. Those people may be harmed. And then there will be a journalistic outcry. We've got to prohibit nitrous oxide. And it's just going to cause problems. It won't help people. You can regulate these things. That does seem like it often has a somewhat positive effect where people have a source of the material where the purity has been defined and access to treatment if they develop a problem with it. Because my assumption is that the subset of people that do develop problems with something like that are already susceptible to problems of that nature generally.
Yeah. Thomas, are you a nitrous user?
I don't think I've ever had nitrous before.
I had nitrous the first time at a Grateful Dead concert.
That might be the one, the one of the major name drugs that I've never dallied with. I'm trying to think now. Jesus. Wait, is it the same as Whippets?
Yes.
I'm kind of a dumb when it comes to that sort of stuff.
You've had Whippets.
It always provided a nice contrast because me and Hamilton, when we lived together, our interests barely overlapped. So I could always rely on him to discuss things. If it's Whippets, then I've done it. Yeah. And I get the crack element because it's like the come down is so abrupt that you want to just be like, oh, I'll just go back there for a second. And then, you got like 5 cans of Ready Whip heading next to your bed. And you're like, well, I guess I better go sneak these into the garbage.
Thomas, can I ask you one follow-up question? I seem to recall that there was an article in the New York Times about you living with Hamilton, and I think it might not have been true at the time. That was maybe you took him for a bit of a ride. I just remember there being an article about you
lived
guys
together.
Yeah, you did live together, right?
Yeah.
So what was
right? We did. We lived together.
There was
over a
someone
year.
that reported us to the New York Times.
Yeah.
We got an emergency email from the journalist who is like, we have received a tip saying that you don't actually live with one another.
Oh.
There was someone who was trying to like infiltrate.
Maybe that was
story.
me. I don't know. Did I send that email? But it was very possible.
I got those.
It was Rocco.
I got those emails on a flight. I was coming back, and so there had already been this emergency discussion. I believe it was between you, Hamilton, and the guy who had kind of our publicity director at Vice, who'd helped grease the wheels for the article. And I remember there was a draft email response that you guys were working on. So I'd missed an hour of back and forth. And when I landed, it was like, quick, check your email. This is an emergency, da, 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 da. And I opened it up and the draft had grown to like 4 paragraphs. And it was the guiltiest reading thing I'd ever seen, where it started with something like, how would one legally define a roommate? Webster says a roommate is the condition or system of that, and so and everybody, all the texts were like, do not respond to anything until we've talked about this or whatever. But I just shot back an email to the reporter immediately. That was, what did I say? It was like,
you said who said
I told you that.
I remember really well. I think you said,
that was it.
Who said I don't live in my apartment?
Oh yeah.
Well, we've established from Hamilton that they don't really care about the facts on certain drug stories, but they're very interested to fact check whether or not you guys actually lived together in 2017 or whenever it was.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Thomas, thank you very much. You have any other questions, or you have any other pointed statements that might get us to Nash on YouTube?
Not to backtrack, but so did the Galaxy people supplant the Philly Mafia? Or is it just kind of, does anybody know?
I believe so. Yeah, maybe it's a tragic tale of corporatization destroying the mom and pop nitrous distributors. It might be
Yeah, I know.
Because it was Philadelphia, Baltimore, and I think Boston were the only places you could get nitrous filled canisters, industrially filled or commercially filled in the United States, and that was how a mafia was able to form, effective, or what the jam band fans called a mafia or whatever. But you mentioned that there's a different, that something had changed in terms of how nitrous could or was distributed. And so I was curious about that, if I can do that as a follow-up.
How it has changed?
I think he's asking
Yeah,
where you can
something-
get it.
Oh, where you can get it?
Yeah.
In
Or where are they getting it? Like
bong stores, bong
wholesale.
purveyors.
Yeah.
Right.
Your local bong.
Wait, no, you say it, not retail. Where's it? Yeah. What
Oh,
happened
you
with where it's...
want like a website? You want a URL?
No, it's just, I was just interested. All right. Yeah, no. I live in a city, man. I can go down the street and find some
go support
crap,
your
some
local
horrible
bong
violence.
shop.
Yeah. All right. Well,
I know.
Thomas.
We call those head shops.
Yeah. I lost the thread on this like about 10 minutes ago, which is great. I've lost control, but I want to return to one thing when we say goodbye to you, Thomas. You do look very thin. You look.
Thanks.
I'm very impressed.
Great as well.
I'm fatter than I've ever been.
There. You get it.
But thanks for shaming me. Thank you, Thomas Morton, and thank you, Hamilton. I appreciate this, and thank you for going into all these. I have like 1,000 more questions that I don't know if are of any interest to anyone, but they're just like my drug questions. So maybe we'll take that offline, so I don't have to get into asking where I get certain drugs, because that's apparently what Thomas wanted to know. All right, well, thank you all for joining us, and please make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a single episode of the Moynihan Report. We'll be back soon. I don't know what we're doing, but it's the same old time, and it's a surprise who will be here next. So, and by the way, Hamilton has a podcast, the Hamilton Morris Show podcast, just the Hamilton Morris.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Patreon.com.
Patreon.com. Go over and subscribe, and we will see you on Thursday.